pull up a chair, friend. The fire's warm tonight, but the world beyond its glow isn't. There's a lake far from here. Quiet, still, wrapped in the kind of Scandinavian calm that makes you feel like nothing bad could ever happen there. But on a June morning in 1960, that illusion shattered. 4 teenagers went camping along the shores of Lake Bodom, and by sunrise, only 2 were alive. What happened in those dark hours has haunted Finland for more than 60 years. A crime with no clear killer, a survivor with no memory, a suspect who changed with every retelling, and a mystery that refuses to stay buried. So settle in, let the fire do its best, because tonight, we're heading to the edge of the water, where the shadows move strangely, where the evidence tells conflicting stories, and the truth is just as cold as the lake itself. Welcome to Lake Bodom on From the Void. There's something about a lake at night that makes you feel like the world has finally exhaled. You've got still water black as glass, a sky that never quite gets dark, just that strange northern twilight. And if you're a teenager in 1960s Finland, it's the perfect place to disappear for a weekend with your friends, and your boyfriend or your girlfriend. No parents, no curfew, just 4 kids, 1 tent, and a quiet shore on a place called Lake Bodom. On the night of June 4th, 1960, 2 young couples rode out on their motorbikes to camp along the water's edge. They pitched a single tent, close enough to the shoreline that you could probably hear every ripple, every fish jump, every whisper. By all accounts, it was ordinary. They drank a little, smoked, talked, the kind of night 1,000 other teenagers have had at 1,000 other lakes. At some point, the fire burned low. The voices got quieter. The zipper closed on the tent. And sometime between 4 and 6 in the morning, someone walked out of the trees. We don't know if the kids were awake. We don't know if the first sound they heard was the tent fabric tearing, or the first blow landing. But we do know this. Whoever came to that campsite didn't unzip the tent. They cut through it. They stabbed and beat the teenagers inside that canvas cocoon, attacking from the outside, slashing blindly through fabric, turning that little pocket of safety into a slaughterhouse. By late morning, the tent was a collapsed, shredded shape on the shoreline. 3 of the teenagers lay dead, and one of them, somehow, was still alive. He would tell police he barely remembered the attack, that his jaw was broken, that he'd seen a figure in dark clothing with strange, almost glowing red eyes. He would live with those memories, and the lack of them, for decades. And then, more than 40 years later, the same survivor would be arrested and accused of being the killer. Before we go any further into what happened that morning, we need to understand where it happened. Because Lake Bodom isn't just a location in this story. It's a character. And like all the good ones, it has layers. In 1960, Finland was a country in transition, recovering from the war, modernizing, rebuilding itself in that practical, unpretentious Scandinavian way. Violent crime was incredibly rare, especially murders, especially anything remotely like this. People didn't lock their doors. Kids ran wild in endless summer daylight. Teenagers went camping with their friends, and no one gave it a second thought. So a slaughter at a lakeside campsite involving 4 kids? This wasn't just shocking. It was unthinkable. Lake Bodom sits just outside Helsinki, in a forested area where people go to swim, fish, sneak a smoke, skip school, fall in love. All the usual rites of teenage rebellion. Back then, it was postcard pretty. Families picnicked on the grass. Kids splashed in the shallows. And in the Finnish summer, the sunlight lingered late into the night like it didn't want to go home. It's the kind of place you could look at and think, nothing bad could ever happen here. But if you talk to people who grew up in the area after the murders, you get a very different story. Parents warning kids not to wander near the lake after dark. Urban legends about a faceless figure in the trees. A shoreline that suddenly felt watched. Lake Bodom stopped being a playground and became a ghost story. That's the power a single moment of violence can have on a place. It rewrites the land, turns a sunny shoreline into a shadow. And when 4 teenagers zipped up their tent on that June night, they weren't stepping into danger. They were stepping into that shadow, one they didn't even know existed. Before their names became headlines, before they turned into case files, theories, and suspects, they were just 4 teenagers. 4 kids who packed up a tent, hopped on a pair of motorbikes, and rode down to the lakeshore for a summer weekend of freedom. Let's meet them. Not as victims, not as clues, but as people. Seppo Boisman was 18. Tall, dark-haired, a little reserved, the kind of kid who looked older than he was, and sometimes acted like it. Friends described him as a calm and dependable person, the kind of guy who made sure everyone got home from the party safely. He wasn't the loud one, and he wasn't the troublemaker. But he loved his motorbike, he loved the independence it gave him, and he loved spending time with his girlfriend, Anya. If you look at old photos from that era, grainy black and whites of Finnish teens leaning against bikes or sitting by the water, you can almost imagine Seppo among them. A kid on the edge of adulthood, trying to figure out his place in the world. On that weekend at Lake Bodom, he was the one who drove one of the bikes. He was the one the others trusted to get them there safely. Anya Maki was only 15. She had that unmistakable look of a teenager whose world is just beginning to open up. Wide eyes, bright smile, plans bigger than the town she came from. Friends remembered her as sweet, shy at times, but with a warm, easy laugh once you got her talking. She and Seppo were a young couple, but by all accounts a steady one. Affectionate, uncomplicated, comfortable. The kind of teenage relationship that feels enormous at the time but still innocent. For Anya, this camping trip wasn't dangerous or rebellious. It was a summer night with people she cared about, and a chance to get away. Malja Ermeli Bjorklund, Ermeli to her friends, was also 15. Quiet, kind, more artistic than adventurous. She loved drawing, loved being outdoors, loved spending time with her boyfriend Nils, who she thought the world of. Ermeli was the youngest looking of the group, still with that softness in her face that tells you she's halfway between childhood and adulthood. She wasn't bold or loud, but she had a gentle confidence about her. On that trip, she slept closest to Nils in the tent. He adored her, and she was, by every account, the emotional center of the group. When people talk about the case of Lake Bodom, they often forget Ermeli was a real girl, someone who doodled in notebooks, someone who probably packed snacks for the trip, someone who had her whole life ahead of her. And then there was Nils Wilhelm Gustafsson, also 18, athletic, social, charismatic in that easy teenage boy way, confident but not arrogant. He played sports, had plenty of friends, and he'd been dating Ermeli for a while. They were young, But this wasn't a fling. They cared deeply for each other. People who knew Nils said he was fun to be around, loyal, the kind of guy who'd pick you up when you were down, or talk you into staying out a little later when you probably shouldn't. He was also the strongest physically, bigger and more athletic than Seppo. Not a fighter, but definitely someone who could take care of himself. Nils had no reason to fear a quiet night at Lake Bodom. He had his girlfriend by his side, his friends with him, and that easy teenage confidence that nothing bad ever happens on a summer night. He had no idea that by the time the sun came up, he would be the only one left alive. Together, the four of them made an easy, natural group. Seppo and Nils had known each other for years. Close friends, sometimes rivals the way teenage boys can be. Their girlfriends liked each other. There was no drama that anyone ever reported. Just four teens on the cusp of adulthood, doing what kids all over the world have done for generations. Sneaking out, heading to the lake, talking about life under the stars. They pitched a tent near the water, they smoked, they shared drinks, they laughed. It was normal. It was innocent. It was a moment frozen in time, right up until the moment it shattered. Morning comes slowly at Lake Bodom in June. The light creeps in softly, almost kindly. And maybe that makes what happened next even harder to imagine. Because in that gentle early sunlight, the aftermath of a nightmare was just lying in the open. Just after sunrise, a group of boys out birdwatching noticed something odd. At a distance, maybe 100, 150 meters away, they saw a tent that looked wrong. Collapsed, misshapen. Not like something neatly packed up, but like something pushed down. One of the boys also noticed something else. A figure, blonde-haired, walking away from the tents and disappearing toward the trees. At the time, the boys didn't make much of it. It was early. They were tired. The details weren't clear. They didn't realize that sighting would later become one of the most debated clues in the entire case. For now, they just kept walking. Around 11 a.m., a local carpenter named Esko Oiva Johansson arrived near the camping area. He'd come to check on some work he was doing. Just another normal day. But as he approached the lakeshore, he noticed the same collapsed tent the boys had seen. It was flattened, slashed, the poles bent inward, and there was something underneath it. Something he couldn't quite make sense of. So he walked closer. And what he found would haunt him forever. 3 bodies, bloodied, motionless, tangled inside a crushed tent. And one more, barely alive, lying outside on the ground. Johansson ran for help. Police arrived around midday. They should have roped off the area. They should have documented every footprint, every blade of grass, every inch of that tent. But this was Finland in 1960. This kind of crime was unheard of. Procedures weren't what they are today. And in the chaos and shock, the mistakes began immediately. Mistake number 1, the scene was never sealed. Locals wandered in. Other campers came to see what had happened. Curious onlookers walked right up to the tent. Some even stepped on the evidence. Mistake number 2. Soldiers were brought in to search for missing items. They meant well. They wanted to help recover stolen belongings. But they trampled the shoreline, the underbrush, the wooded path. Areas that may have held crucial footprints or dropped objects. Mistake number 3. Items were moved before being photographed. Some clothing was repositioned. Motorcycle gear was touched. Even the tent was adjusted to check for survivors before proper documentation. None of it malicious, all of it catastrophic. The crime scene at Lake Bodom wasn't just contaminated, it was ruined. investigators later identified several key details, but none could be fully trusted because of how compromised the scene was. Number 1, Nils' shoes, found almost 500 meters away, partly hidden. They contained blood from all 3 victims, but no detectable blood from Nils himself. A strange, haunting clue, but damaged by the fact that dozens of people had walked those same paths before police realized the significance. Number 2, missing belongings. Wallets, clothing, motorcycle keys were gone. But were they stolen by the killer, or picked up by curious locals before police arrived? There was no way to know anymore. Number 3, the tent. Slashed from the outside, dozens of cuts. But the canvas had been moved, handled, even lifted before forensic teams could analyze it. Number 4, footprints. Multiple sets. Too many to distinguish. Victims, killer, police, soldiers, locals. All mixed into a chaotic mess. Number 5, the suspected pathway toward the trees. Possibly the escape route. Possibly just where a handful of curious teenagers wandered through out of morbid fascination. The truth was buried before the investigation even began. Meanwhile, Nils Gustafsson, the lone survivor, was lying on the ground beside the collapsed tent. His jaw was shattered. His face was swollen and bruised. He had stab wounds on his body. He was covered in blood, though not all of it was his. He drifted in and out of consciousness, barely able to speak, barely able to understand what had happened. He was rushed to the hospital where doctors said these injuries should have killed him. But they didn't. And that simple fact, his survival, would eventually turn him from victim into suspect. By the end of the day, the bodies were removed. The tent was collected. The area was left still and quiet again. But the truth, whatever it was, had already been stomped into the dirt. Clues were gone, tracks were erased, and the killer, whoever they were, had slipped into the countryside long before anyone realized a monster had been among them. The investigation was now crippled. Everything from this point forward would be guesswork built on top of compromised evidence. And it would stay that way for decades. The moment police stepped into the campsite at Lake Bodom, they knew they were dealing with something Finland had almost no experience with. A brutal, multi-victim homicide, with no witnesses, no weapon, and no clear motive. But what they didn't realize, at least not yet, was that the most important clues were already gone. Still, the investigators did what they could with what they had. And what they had was confusing, contradictory, and deeply compromised. This was the era before DNA testing, before modern crime scene protocols, before computers, databases, and digital imaging. In 1960, forensics meant blood type comparisons, fiber analysis, simple footprint casting, tool mark identification, witness statements, and a whole lot of intuition. Against a meticulous, fast-moving, violent attacker who left almost nothing behind, Finland's investigators were already at a disadvantage. There was plenty of blood on the tent, on the ground, on the victims, on Nils' clothing and shoes. But the scene contamination meant nothing could be conclusively mapped. Bloodstains that might have told a story were smeared, stepped on, or wiped by accident. Footprints, there were dozens. Some barefoot, some in shoes, some partially erased. None could be confidently tied to the killer. The missing weapons, both the stabbing weapon and the blunt object, were gone. Police searched the shoreline, dragged parts of the lake, combed the forest. Nothing. Not a single trace. As investigators tried to reconstruct what had happened, a few theories took shape. Number 1, a random drifter or local drunk. There were rumors of vagrants or unstable men wandering the area, but nothing tied any of them to the scene. No motive, no sightings, no physical evidence. And so, the theory evaporated. Number 2, a crime of passion. Because Ermeli, Nils' girlfriend, suffered the most severe wounds, some investigators suspected a stalker, an obsessed stranger, someone who fixated specifically on her. But no jealous ex-boyfriends existed, no local men had ties to her, and no one in her life matched the profile. So that theory softened too. Number 3, a planned attack. Some believe the killer selected the teens deliberately, approaching silently, attacking through the tent, targeting multiple victims rapidly, taking items afterward, and vanishing unseen. This wasn't impulsive, it was controlled. But who plans to murder 4 teenagers with no clear motive? Investigators needed suspects, real ones, and they started to emerge. Finland didn't have serial killers or mass murderers in 1960, so every unusual local suddenly became suspicious. 3 names rose to the surface. Number 1, Pentti Soininen, the confessing teen criminal, a violent young offender who later confessed in prison to the murders, but would have been around 14 years old at the time. Police doubted he had the strength or the psychological sophistication to kill 3 older teens and overpower a 4th. His confession was dismissed as attention-seeking. Number 2, Carl Valdemar Gillstrom, the kiosk man. A difficult, temperamental local man known for harassing campers, throwing stones, cutting guys' ropes, threatening teens on the lakeshore. He'd allegedly drunkenly boasted about committing the murders. Neighbors whispered that his wife provided a shaky alibi. Some locals said he poured concrete into a well after the murders to hide something. But the police barely investigated him. No search of the well, no deep interviews, and no serious pursuit. This would come back to haunt the case. Number 3, Hans Osman, the German stranger with bloody clothes. A mysterious man who came into a Helsinki hospital the next day with blood-stained clothing, dirty fingernails, and strange behavior. He pretended to be unconscious. Nurses later said he looked like someone who'd been in a fight outdoors. He also matched the description of the blonde man seen by the birdwatchers. Police later accepted an alibi. But it wasn't airtight. And rumors about him being a KGB defector added fuel to the fire. As summer turned to fall, the case went cold. The evidence wasn't strong enough to point to any one suspect. Witness accounts were inconsistent. Forensic conclusions contradicted each other, and the public began to realize that this investigation was deeply flawed. And it wasn't long before fingers started pointing at the police themselves. Why wasn't the scene protected? Why wasn't the escaped path analyzed first? Why weren't suspects thoroughly questioned? And why weren't crucial leads followed? The truth is simple. They'd never seen anything like this before. And by the time they learned how to investigate something like this, it was far too late. But the biggest twist in the case was still more than 40 years away. Because one day, police would return to the Lake Bodom file, and they realized something chilling. They may have missed the real killer. And worse, the killer might have been with them the whole time. So let's take a deeper dive into the 3 original suspects. Our first suspect wasn't a monster, he was a troubled kid. Pentti Soininen had a long juvenile record. Burglary, vandalism, petty violence. He grew up in hardship, bounced between institutions, constantly in trouble. He was the kind of kid society forgets until he does something wrong. Years after the Lake Bodom murders while in prison, Pentti made a shocking confession. He said he murdered the teenagers. Not once, not in passing, but repeatedly, to guards and to other inmates. And some of the details he gave sounded disturbingly accurate. But again, here's the problem we mentioned earlier. Pentti would have only been about 14 years old in 1960. A 14-year-old overpowering and killing an athletic 18-year-old male, another 18-year-old male, and 2 teenage girls. With precision, silence, and speed? Highly unlikely. Even seasoned investigators doubted he had the strength or the psychological capacity. So again, why confess? Some people think Pentti wanted attention. Others think he wanted to seem powerful. Maybe he was just a broken kid who internalized a national boogeyman story and made it his own. Sadly, in 1969, on the 9th anniversary of the murders, Pentti died by suicide. And with him went the possibility of ever knowing if he was telling the truth, or just echoing a nightmare he desperately wanted to be part of. And then there was the most feared man around the lake, and maybe the most likely killer, Carl Valdemar Gillstrom, or the Kiosk Man. If you talk to people who lived near Lake Bodom in the 1950s and 60s, this is the one name that comes up more than any other. He owned a small kiosk near the lake, selling snacks, drinks, cigarettes. But he wasn't exactly the friendly shopkeeper type. Again, he was known for harassing teenagers, throwing rocks at campers, slashing tent lines, threatening people who came too close to his lakeshore, and being physically aggressive when drunk. Locals were afraid of him. Some even said he hated teenagers with a kind of irrational fury. And after the murders, rumors spread that Gillstrom had confessed while drunk, not once, but multiple times. One neighbor claimed he admitted to killing the teens and said something like, "Everyone will know someday." Another said his wife originally gave him an alibi, but later privately told people that she lied out of fear. And then there was the well. Witnesses said that shortly after the murders, Gillstrom was seen pouring concrete into a well on his property. Why? No one knows. Police never checked the well. They never dug it up. They never even questioned him thoroughly. And in 1969, 9 years after the murders, Gillstrom walked into Lake Bodom and drowned himself. Was it coincidence? Was it guilt? Or just a deeply troubled man at the end of his rope? We'll never know. But ask the locals around the lake who they think did it, and most will point to the Kiosk Man. And then there's the third, Hans Osman, the Bloody Stranger. The suspect straight out of a Cold War thriller. If this case were a movie, Hans Osman would be the character you'd swear the writers made up. Tall, blonde, German, rumored KGB ties, a questionable past in wartime Europe, and the day after the Lake Bodom murders, he walked into a Helsinki hospital with blood on his clothes. Nurses said he acted bizarrely, pretending to be unconscious, jerking awake suddenly, staring at staff with glassy eyes. He had dirt under his nails, scratches, signs of a struggle. And he looked, almost exactly, like the blonde man those birdwatchers described walking away from the campsite at dawn. But here's where things get complicated. Police questioned him later and accepted his alibi. Case closed. Except, the alibi was never publicly verified. The timeline didn't fully add up. His behavior was undeniably suspicious, and some investigators privately believed he was involved in other violent crimes. Osman denied everything, until the day he died. Still, his name floats around the case like a ghost. A reminder of how uneasy it feels when someone fits the story a little too well. And then there's the mystery man in the funeral photo. A face that looks too familiar, in the wrong place at the wrong time. There's a photograph, one of the most infamous in Finnish true crime history. It was taken at the funeral of one of the victims. Mourners gathered around the grave, heads bowed, eyes swollen from crying. And somewhere in the background, partially obscured, stands a man. A man who looks strikingly similar to the police sketch created from Nils' hypnotically recovered memory. Longish blonde hair, distinct facial structure, stiff posture, staring directly toward the camera. Who was he? No one knows. Some say it was Hans Osman. Others swear it wasn't. Police could never identify him with certainty. It's one of the most unsettling details of the entire case. A stranger at a funeral, who might have been the killer, standing a few feet from grieving parents, just watching. And then there's the unnamed stranger theory, the faceless boogeyman always lurking just beyond the evidence. Some investigators and many Finns believe the simplest explanation is also the most haunting, that the killer was someone unknown, a drifter, a traveler passing through, a disturbed individual who saw the tent, watched it quietly, and then acted on some dark impulse. This theory explains the randomness, the missing belongings, the silent approach, the brutality, the vanishing without a trace, and the fact that no suspect ever perfectly fit the evidence. But it also leaves us with the most terrifying possibility, that the killer didn't stay. They didn't confess. They didn't get caught. They just kept walking. And then there's the survivor himself, Nils Gustafsson. The twist Finland never saw coming. The 2004-2005 reopening of the case and the trial that shook Finland. By the early 2000s, the Lake Bodom case was more myth than investigation. Most of the original detectives were gone. Witnesses had faded into memory. Evidence had been boxed, archived, and forgotten. But in 2003, something changed. A new generation of investigators, equipped with modern forensics, DNA testing, and fresh eyes, decided to reopen the file. And when they went back through the crime scene photos, the statements, the autopsy reports, and critically, the surviving physical evidence, they noticed something the original detectives had never considered. Some of the clues didn't entirely line up with Nils Gustafsson's account. And slowly, almost reluctantly, the investigation began turning toward the one person everyone assumed was a victim. Modern forensic teams analyzed blood patterns, fabric tears, and one particularly strange detail: Nils' shoes. Found 500 meters away, partially hidden. They contained blood from all three victims, but none of Nils' own blood. This fact unnerved investigators. How could his shoes be covered in everyone else's blood, but not his own, if he was wearing them during the attack? The new theory: he wasn't wearing them, the killer was. Then there was the distribution of injuries, beating versus stabbing. The girls and Seppo suffered fatal stab wounds. Nils suffered mostly blunt force trauma, no fatal stab wounds. Could that mean he was attacked first, outside the tent, during a drunken fight? Could an argument with Seppo have escalated? Could rage, jealousy, or intoxication have turned a scuffle into slaughter? The new investigators thought it was possible. In March 2004, police arrested Nils Gustafsson, now in his 60s, and charged him with 3 counts of murder. Finland was stunned. This was like accusing the last survivor of a plane crash of causing the accident. The prosecution laid out a dramatic hypothesis. One, a drunken argument. According to the state, Nils became intoxicated. He and Seppo argued, possibly over the girls, and a fight broke out. Seppo punched him, breaking his jaw. Hypothesis number 2 was jealous rage. They suggested Nils snapped, attacked Seppo first, then turned on the girls, targeting Ermeli, his own girlfriend, with the fiercest violence, inflicting stab wounds post-mortem out of rage or rejection. Number 3, scene staging. After the killings, prosecutors alleged Nils stabbed himself lightly, hit himself with a rock, removed his shoes, walked around the tent as the killer, hid the shoes, collapsed outside the tent to appear as a victim. It was dramatic and shocking. Cinematic even. But was it true? Nils' defense team dismantled the state's case piece by piece. Number 1, the injuries were too severe to fake. Doctors testified that his broken jaw, facial fractures, and overall trauma could not have been self-inflicted, would have caused near immediate unconsciousness, made movement, let alone murder, extremely unlikely. Number 2, no motive made sense. Friends and family said no love triangle existed, no jealousy, no history of violent behavior, no known mental health issues. Number 3, forensics were too contaminated. Given the chaos at the scene, blood transfer could not be trusted. Footprints were unusable. Staging the scene would have required more clarity and control than Nils could have had. And number 4, the timeline didn't support it. If Nils had fought Seppo first, his injuries should have severely limited motor function. He likely wouldn't have had the strength to kill 3 people. One expert put it simply, he was too damaged to be the assailant. The verdict in October 2005. After months of testimony, hundreds of exhibits, and decades of speculation, the court ruled Nils Gustafsson was not guilty, acquitted on all charges. The state paid him compensation, about £44,900 for wrongful accusation and emotional suffering, and the case, once again, went cold. So what do we make of it? Was the prosecution reaching? Was the defense too persuasive? Was the evidence too damaged? Or did the real killer slip through the cracks decades earlier? Nils himself stayed quiet after the trial, rarely speaking publicly about the case. He lived the rest of his life under a cloud of suspicion from some and vindication from others. The trial didn't solve the murders. In many ways, it deepened the mystery. Because if Nils didn't do it, and the kiosk man didn't do it, and Osmond didn't do it, then who did? And why? The evidence has been tested, retested, debated, and fought over for 64 years. And still, the truth feels just out of reach. Like a figure walking through morning mist on the shoreline of Lake Bodom, seen for a moment and then gone. Some murder cases are solved. Some fade away, but some become something else entirely. They leave the realm of crime and enter the realm of folklore. They stop being events and become symbols, warnings, stories parents whisper to their kids. That's what happened at Lake Bodom. Because the murders didn't just fracture a community, they seeped into the culture. And for decades afterward, the shadow of what happened there never fully lifted. Before June 1960, Lake Bodom meant family picnics, summer swims, teenagers sneaking cigarettes, young love, warm nights under endless sunlight. But after the murders, it meant fear. A place that once represented youth and freedom now represented something darker. A reminder that danger can come quietly and unexpectedly and without reason. Locals stopped going near the lake at night. Children were warned. Don't wander too close. Someone dangerous might be waiting. It was no longer water and trees. It was a wound. Today, if you travel to the police museum in Tampere, you can see one of the most haunting artifacts in Finnish history: the original Lake Bodom tent. It sits behind glass, still slashed, still stained, still torn the way it was found on that June morning. Around 2020, forensic teams even took new fiber samples from the canvas, still hoping that modern technology might reveal something the investigators of 1960 never could. A tent that once sheltered 4 teenagers is now a memorial to the unanswered questions that have haunted Finland for more than 6 decades. The Lake Bodom murders didn't stay confined to the police files. They inspired books, documentaries, countless articles, true crime podcasts, folk tales told by campfires, even a horror film. And yes, some say it influenced aspects of Friday the 13th, the idea of teenagers slaughtered at a lakeside campsite. In the public imagination, Bodom became shorthand for a very specific kind of fear: the fear of being vulnerable in a place that's supposed to be safe. Like all unsolved cases, Bodom attracted its fair share of myths. Shadowy figures seen walking the shoreline, strange red lights in the woods, ghost stories of the victims, whispers that the killer returned to the lake years later, claims that certain locals knew who did it but never spoke up, and of course the decades of speculation about Nils. Some of these rumors came from grief, some from fear, some from the human need to explain the unexplicable, and some from the uncomfortable truth that we don't know what happened. Not really. Not in a way that brings closure. Why this case? Why did this murder among thousands become a legend? Maybe because the victims were young. Maybe because the crime was shocking. Maybe because the investigation failed so dramatically. Maybe because the suspects were compelling, each one a different archetype. Or maybe because there's something inherently unsettling about a killer who could walk into a quiet campsite, murder 3 people, injure a 4th, and disappear. No noise, no panic, and no trace. Just footprints in soft earth and a lifetime of questions. If you visit Lake Bodom today, it doesn't feel evil. It feels peaceful, calm, almost serene. Kids swim there again. Couples walk along the shore. Boats glide across the water. But if you stand there long enough, if you listen, you start to understand why this case stayed alive for so long. The silence feels heavy, not threatening, just unfinished. Like the lake is holding something beneath its surface. A name, a face, a moment of violence frozen in time. And maybe that's why the Lake Bodom murders still haunt Finland. Because some stories don't fade. Some wounds don't close. And some questions were never meant to be answered. So here we are, more than 60 years later, sitting with a case that refuses to give us closure. We've walked through the evidence, the suspects, the trial, and the impact. Now it's time to do what people have done since the night of the murders. Try to make sense of something senseless. Not to solve it, because if the greatest investigators in modern forensics couldn't crack it, we probably won't either. But to look at each theory one by one and ask, what makes this theory compelling? And what makes it fall apart? So let's start with the one that feels the most straightforward. The unknown outsider. A stranger in the woods, an opportunistic killer. This is the theory that keeps people up at night. That a stranger, someone the teens had never met, saw the tent in the thin pre-dawn light and decided to attack. It explains a lot. The randomness, the brutality, the lack of motive, the missing items, the silence of the attack, the vanishing afterward. It also ties neatly to the blonde man seen by the birdwatchers leaving the scene. Someone who walked away quietly without panic, as if this wasn't their first time taking a life. But the problem here is that there's no evidence. There's no DNA, no confession, No pattern of similar crimes before or after. It explains everything by explaining nothing. Theory number 2, Carl Valdemar Gillstrom, the kiosk man, the local menace with a history of violence. If you ask locals, this is the name they mention first. Gillstrom hated campers, he harassed teenagers, he had a temper. He was unpredictable when drinking, and he allegedly confessed multiple times when he was drunk. Some neighbors insist he told them, "I did it and no one will ever prove it." His wife may have lied to protect him. He poured concrete into a well shortly after the murders. And 9 years later, he drowned himself in the same lake. It's compelling, almost too compelling. The problem? Police barely investigated him. His confessions could have been drunken bluster, and there's no physical evidence tying him to the crime. The kiosk man fits the emotional truth, but not the forensic one. Theory 3, Hans Osman, the mysterious foreigner with bloody clothes and a Cold War aura. This one feels like a thriller. A tall, blonde man shows up the day after the murders with blood on his clothes and an attitude that makes nurses uneasy. Rumors swirl about him working with the KGB, his behavior is strange. His appearance matches the blonde figure from the Birdwatchers. It feels like a perfect fit. But once again, his alibi, though strange, was accepted. The blood wasn't confirmed to belong to the victims, and no evidence places him at the scene. Osman remains an icon of the case, but mostly because he seems like the kind of person who would do something like this. But that's not proof. That's just a story we tell ourselves. And then there's Theory 4, multiple attackers. A coordinated assault possibly fueled by alcohol or group aggression. Some investigators believe one person couldn't have slashed the tent, attacked 4 people, overpowered 2 strong 18-year-old boys, dragged or moved bodies, hidden shoes, stolen items, and fled silently, all in minutes. A second attacker solved some of the problems: faster attack, more control, less resistance, cleaner disappearance. But it also raises huge questions. Who were they? Why leave no trace? Why never speak? Why no similar crimes? There's no evidence for multiple attackers, but there's no evidence against it either. Theory 5, Nils himself, the survivor. The theory investigators revived after 44 years. This is the most controversial theory and the one that tore Finland apart during the 2005 trial 20 years ago. It suggests a drunken fight broke out, that Seppo and Nils clashed, Nils snapped, he killed the others in rage, he staged the scene, injured himself, collapsed outside the tent. The evidence, his shoes had everyone else's blood, his own blood wasn't found on them, his memories were fragmented, his injuries were real but possibly not fatal. For some, the theory felt elegant, psychologically tidy, but the problems are massive. Doctors say he couldn't have killed anyone with those injuries, no proven motive, he had no history of violence, no confession, no forensic trail tying him directly to any weapon, and no indication he ever lied about what he remembered. And the court agreed. The evidence against Nils wasn't just weak, it was inconsistent, circumstantial, and speculative. And so he was acquitted. But for many Finns, the suspicion never fully faded. And then there's Theory 6, the unsolvable truth. The lake holds the answers and it isn't talking. Some murders aren't unsolved because they're complicated. Some are unsolved because the first 24 hours doomed everything. The contaminated crime scene, the missed footprints, the moved objects, the discarded leads, the lack of forensic technology, the decades that passed before reinvestigation. By the time the case was reopened, the truth wasn't just buried, it had evaporated. The most realistic theory may be the simplest and saddest. We may never know what happened inside that tent. Not because the killer was brilliant, but because the investigation just wasn't. There's one more theory, the one no one likes to say out loud. That whoever killed the teens at Lake Bodom never killed again. Not before, and not after. That the violence was a singular event. A moment of madness or opportunity or impulse, and when it was over, the killer walked away into the early summer morning light and lived the rest of their life quietly, ordinary, unremarkable. A ghost who learned how to be a person again. There's something about unsolved cases that gets under our skin. Maybe it's the lack of answers, maybe it's the stories we build around the silence, Or maybe it's something deeper. That ancient part of us that wants the world to make sense, to be fair, to be explainable. But the truth is, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes violence arrives quietly, in the middle of the night, for reasons that have nothing to do with the people who suffer from it. Sometimes the evidence is lost. Sometimes the answers rot away with time. Sometimes the person who knows the truth dies with it locked inside them. And sometimes, the lake just keeps its secrets. When you stand on the shores of Lake Bodom today, you might feel a chill. Not because the place is cursed or evil or haunted, but because you're standing in a spot where something terrible happened. Something that shattered families, rocked a country, and slipped into legend. A place where 3 young lives ended, and 1 life was forever altered. A place where the line between tragedy and mystery blurred into something else entirely. Maybe the reason the Lake Bodom murders stayed alive in our imagination is because they remind us how fragile we all are, how a single moment can change everything, how safety can be an illusion, how the world can turn dark without warning. But they also remind us of something else, that the stories we tell, the ones we revisit, retell, and pass along, aren't just about fear. They're about trying to understand the darkness so it doesn't swallow us. They're about keeping memory alive, keeping questions alive, keeping humanity alive in the spaces where certainty died. Tonight, we walked back to a lakeshore in Finland, where 4 kids pitched a tent on a warm summer night and never imagined anything could hurt them. And maybe that's the lesson we're left with. That the scariest stories aren't about monsters in the woods, or ghosts in the water, or legends whispering through the trees. The scariest stories are the ones where a real person walks out of the forest at dawn, commits unimaginable violence, and then vanishes into history without a trace. Some mysteries want to be solved. This one wants to stay in the void.